All right, we are discussing the seventh chapter of Kohelet, the seventh chapter of Ecclesiastes now. We're about halfway through the chapter, not quite halfway. It's a long chapter. As I mentioned many times, we didn't break up the chapters. That was done by Christian monks sometime in the past. So I kind of question why this chapter is a lot longer than some of the other ones, but okay, that's what it is. We will get started. Let me just put on the chat, as I always do, our link. So that's there in case anybody wants to review any of our previous classes or go back and if you missed something. So please feel free to check out the link. I did speak with my team member who puts them up on the website. He said he should be getting, if all the previous classes are not there, they will be soon. So just keep an eye open for them. I'm sorry if you've gone there and have not seen recent classes. I don't take care of that. Somebody else takes care of that. So I have put in a word with them to ask to make sure that gets done. Okay. So as I said, we are in the middle of the seventh chapter of Kohelet. And we actually last week, in case you missed it, we did one verse, which is a rarity for us. We usually do quite a few. We do 4 or 5 or so, depending on week by week, it changes. But last week we did one verse and it took the entire session. It was a pretty chock full verse. It's actually a pretty short verse, but what was interesting was if you missed it, we discussed that there were even from the times of the sages, from the Midrash, you already find that there are 2 ways to read that verse. I'm going to do a quick recap, just because it flows into this week's verses, but I won't spend too much time on it. So, without any further ado, we got our share screen over here. Okay. Let me just set this up here. Why isn't this working for me? Okay, there you go. All right. So, and last week's verse again was, let me make this a little bit bigger. I'm sorry. I thought I had it bigger before. Well, that's a little too big. Okay. You know what? Let's make it really big. Makes it a little easier. Here. Yeah. You're welcome, Ira. Yeah. So, this was last week's verse. Yeah. Okay. So I'll make sure to have it this large in any coming week. This was last week's verse. Again, not what we're doing this week, but we said that there's 2 ways of understanding this. It says, Tov acharit davar mereshi tov. The simple understanding was that it is good. The end of a matter is better than the beginning. And tov erech ruach migavah ruach, and better is patience than haughtiness or hubris. I actually preferred the term hubris last week because it kind of fit better into what we were trying to get to. So again, the first understanding of this verse is that the end of a matter is greater than the beginning of a matter. That means that sometimes you see something and you're still in the middle of developing. It's still in the middle of evolving into what it's supposed to be. So to pass judgment on a matter before it reaches its culmination would be unfair, I would say. Inappropriate, unfair. You're looking at something while it's still progressing, instead of looking at something after it's already fully developed. And in that sense, the second half of the verse is telling us that patience is going to pay off in this case. You want to have patience and wait, especially when dealing with other people. And you see somebody who's acting rude or inappropriate, or you may see somebody when they're still in the middle of learning their lessons. So of course, that doesn't mean that you don't have reason to be upset at them, but it's helpful to have in yourself the patience to wait and see where a person ends up. Maybe you could be a teacher for them too in that sense, as opposed to standing from this high point and looking down and saying, I think I know the whole story. That's a high level of hubris or haughtiness. Okay. So again, patience will pay off greater than haughtiness. That's the main explanation. In fact, that's the explanation that's going to fit better in the coming verses, in the flow of the verses. But we said that there was another explanation. That's the explanation that's explained by Rabbi Akiva, the great sage Rabbi Akiva, my namesake. And he says that the way you read the verse is, Tov acharit davar. The end of a matter becomes good, mereshi tov, because of the work you put in the beginning. Okay? So the preparation that you put in the beginning of something will bear fruit at the end. The end of a matter will be better because of its beginning. And therefore, the end of the verse is saying that in that case also, patience is going to help you out. Where if you decide that you know everything, right? If we just think that we know everything and we don't put in the work to prepare for it, well, then you're going to end up losing out. You're going to end up with a substandard product. Okay. So again, that was another explanation that was Rabbi Akiva's explanation. The first explanation was Rabbi Meir, who was actually a student of Rabbi Akiva, and the second explanation is Rabbi Akiva. We discussed last week who cares what about these people themselves. I would suggest if you did not catch last week's class, we spent 45 minutes on just this one verse and what the different ways of explaining it come out to say. So we won't spend too much time on that. Let's just say like this. I want to go with that first explanation, that this verse over here is saying that don't look at something while it's still in the process of developing. Rather, you want to look at something from after something is fully developed, or you want to have patience for something to come to its development. Particularly, again, as we said, this chapter is mostly talking about relationship with other people, how to build and cultivate relationships with other people. In that sense, yes, you sometimes deal with people who are not very polite, or they are, or just outright rude. And you have to understand that perhaps there's a possibility that they're still developing their sense of how to deal with other people. It's always funny because we always think we're in the right. No matter what, we always, for the most part, we generally tend to think we're in the right. Anybody who drives faster than me is crazy. Anybody who drives slower than me is holding up the traffic. That's just how we tend to be. So we would have this patience for ourselves. It's harder to have it for other people. When we recognize when we're still working on a midah, when we're still working on a character trait, it's something I'm working on. It's something I'm putting the work into. But if somebody else treats us, we say, why hasn't this person done anything? Why hasn't this person gotten better, acting better already? So that, unfortunately, tends to be our experience. And that's what we're trying to counteract with this verse over here, which flows very well into this week's verse, okay? Or the beginning of this week's verses, which is verse number 9. Okay, so let me highlight this, bring our attention to it. Sorry, I seem to be running into an issue with my mouse pad here. Okay, all right, verse number 9. And we'll take this piece by piece, as we always do. And it says like this: Al tevahel b'ruchacha lichos. Do not hurry in your spirit to be angry, to become angry. Okay, the word there is kaas. Chaf ayin samach. That means anger. Okay, we've actually seen this before in this very chapter. We talked about anger before, so that we'll talk about the shift that he makes about anger. But again, al tevahel b'ruchacha lichos. Do not hurry in your spirit to become angry. Because anger settles in the lap of the fools. Okay. Now there's a lot of kind of new words here. If you're not familiar with the language, there's a lot of new words here. So again, we'll take that piece by piece. Let me read the verse one more time straight through, and then we'll discuss the different words showing up here. Once again, is al tevahel b'ruchacha lichos. Do not hurry in your spirit to become angry. Because anger settles in the lap of the fools. Okay, so just to explain a couple of these words. Bahel, Beis, Beit Hey Lamed. That is, we actually had this. This did come up earlier in the book, but it means to hurry in commotion. So maher would be to hurry. Maher would be just to hurry. Here is to hurry in commotion. So there's chaos going around you, and you hurry. We have it actually comes up a number of times within Jewish law. It talks about we're afraid sometimes that if we don't allow certain ways of putting out fires on Shabbat, putting out a fire on Shabbat, extinguishing a fire, is one of the 39 things that we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So we are afraid that if we didn't allow it in certain instances or allow you to do certain things, that a person would be bahul al mamono, that a person would be in chaos over the loss of money that they're going to deal with, and they may end up doing something that's not allowed on Shabbat. Just as a side point, in regards to actual practical halacha, if a person has a fire going on their house, there's nothing that they can't do on Shabbat. I want to make that clear. No one should walk away from this thinking that you can't, if there's a danger to life, you absolutely can put out a fire. You could definitely call 911, no question about it. Just throwing that out there. That's not the point of this class, but you should walk away knowing that that's not there's no question there. There was a period of time in the past where people had a lot less stuff at home, and people did not necessarily hang around in their houses. And that's where any discussion in halacha about whether or not you're allowed to put out the fire, usually discussing those cases. In our cases, with our houses, the way we live our lives, no question you can put out a fire that's going to spread and burn down the house. It's a danger to life, to not just your life, but the life of the people around you. Again, totally not what we're talking about. The point is that word bahel shows up over there. In commotion, in all the craziness going on, we lose our minds. We lose our sense of our senses, I guess. And that's what bahel is, not just hurrying, but it's hurrying amongst chaos. Okay? So it's very much the feeling you would get if somebody does something against you, right? Somebody is rude to you. Somebody cuts you off. The way the road rage works is somebody cuts you off and immediately you want to get them back or go around them or honk at them. And that's not necessarily a well thought out response, right? It's a reactive response. That's really what bahel means. Don't hurry to react in your spirit, meaning with all your power, with your power inside of you, to anger. So avoid, in this case, is saying avoid anger. That would be the easy way to put it. Now, what's interesting is, as I mentioned before, we had earlier in the chapter where he says that tov ka'as misachok, that anger is better than laughter, right? He did say earlier that, again, anger is better than laughter. And if you recall, we discussed over there that the idea on that situation is that that's where a person is harboring intense feelings in their heart. They have anger towards somebody. And in that sense, in that case, you don't want to hold on to your anger. You don't want to just simmer with it forever. You want to actually express it. So in the relationship, in that interrelationship with other people, one of the things that you do want to do is express your anger. If you have anger, if you have a reason to be angry, it's better to speak that out than to hold it in and to harbor it in your heart and keep that, because eventually it will explode in a different way. In that sense, it's better than laughter, meaning that passive aggressive, laughing, pretending everything's all right. Okay, so even though he seemed to have praised anger earlier, here he's actually saying that anger is really something you really do want to avoid. Okay, as I mentioned way back last November when we started the class, the sages had a question about whether they wanted to canonize Kohelet as a book of the Tanakh, as one of the 24 books of the Tanakh. They questioned whether they had wanted to do that because there are a number of instances where he contradicts himself from one verse to the next. Now, if you understand, if you have a system of how to learn the book, and you look into what the underlying messages are, you'll see there's not necessarily contradictions like we just have over here. Even though he praised anger earlier, he says to avoid it over here. Now, that doesn't mean that he's contradicting himself. They're talking about different instances. All right, so that's a simple example of where, without looking into what the words mean, you will find potential contradictions in the book of Kohelet. So, again, we want to avoid anger. Key, because because anger settles. It settles in the lap of fools. Okay, chek is a lap. I don't know where else that term shows up except when talking about laps. It's not a very common part of the body to discuss, which is actually interesting that he chooses it over here. He doesn't say that anger settles in the head of a fool. He doesn't say that anger settles in the actions of a fool or in the speech of a fool. He says that anger settles in the lap of a fool. I find that to be interesting itself. Yanuach being the word to settle. Okay, if you pay attention to the High Holiday prayers, there's a period where we say the kind of the highlight of the prayer service where we talk about when God decides what's going to be in the coming year. So one of the things we say is Mia Nua or Mia Nua, who will be unsettled, who will be constantly in a state of flux, and who will be settled. So Nach means to settle. Okay, that's the shoresh over there is Nun and Chet. I'm not sure if there may be another letter to that, but in general with Nun, Shorashim, with root words that have the letter Nun, you usually can drop or letters. So suffice it to say, Yanuach means to settle. So I found this interesting because a lap famously does not exist when you're standing, right? It's one of those old riddles that we like to say, right? What do you have when you're sitting down, but you don't have when you're standing up? And it's a lap, right? Usually it's your thighs, and when you sit down, it turns into a lap. So I find that interesting because we have this, he's drawing this picture of settling, of getting stuck in a place, right? Yanuach telling us to settle, that it settles. We have this chek, the lap, showing up also, indicating this idea of settling into place. It's sitting down. I found this interesting because we've seen a number of times already where you have essentially perfectly smart people, wise people, who, because of some interaction with somebody, they turn towards foolishness. And again, this is so common when we actually get stuck in a conversation or in an argument with another person. It's so easy for us to lose sight of our actual wisdom. So again, this is a book of wisdom. We're looking at the wisdom and how to gain wisdom and how to grow in our wisdom. And he says, if you want to settle into a state of foolishness, anger is your key. And what anger does is it turns your thighs into a lap. It settles in your lap, in the lap of fools. So it kind of sits down with you. You may be a wise person in general, a well thought out person in general, but as soon as you get into an argument with somebody and anger starts to enter the picture, that causes you to sit down. It settles in your lap and it stays there. So that's kind of the picture that he's drawing over here, is that chas b'chik kesilim yanuach, anger, you don't want to fall into anger because anger causes a person to become a kasil, to become this fool. And again, a fool, the idea of a fool is somebody who's, or the word kasil kind of hints to the idea of being stuffed up, right? Covered with a layer that doesn't allow wisdom to enter the ears. And so this also, it's the anger settles you into this state of kasil, this state of being foolish to the point where nothing can enter your ears anymore. So that's the main lesson that he seems to be indicating over here, is that when you're rushed and you're in the heat of a conversation, you really want to avoid entering into that anger state, because anger is going to lead you to just becoming foolish. I've seen it so many times. I've been the person so many times that in the middle of an argument where I have perfectly rational arguments, at least I think so, or somebody else has perfectly rational arguments, but because somebody got their goat, they lose their ability to make coherent arguments anymore. And even worse is when you lose the ability to admit that you're mistaken. Now, that's something that takes a lot of work to admit that, I was wrong. So you're never going to be able to do that if you're in a state of kasil, because a kasil is stuffed up. His ears, their eyes, everything is stuffed up. They can't see past themselves. And anger, again, is kind of that key to that door. Anger settles that in your lap and makes you sit down as a fool. So I think that's the main idea. It's really building up after that last verse. So again, that last verse, we said that that when you're dealing with another person, you would treat yourself with a certain level of patience. I know that I'm still trying to grow. I'm still trying to become a better person. So I wouldn't fault myself if I made certain mistakes. But with that guy over there, they're probably, they probably made that decision. They decided to be like that. And so that patience or impatience and that hubris, where you think you know everything about the person's life, can very easily lead to that chaos, to that anger, and that anger can make you lose your own sense of wisdom. So again, that's why for the flow of the verses, even though we had two explanations in the previous verse, I think we're going to stick to this one because it fits a little better in the flow of the verses. Potentially, we could relearn the verse also as fitting better with the other explanation, but we'll stick to this for right now. Okay, so again, that was chapter 7, verse number 9. And I'm going to move now on to verse number 10. And this, I think, is kind of finishing up the thought with one last idea, one last verse. It's a bit of a longer verse, as you see over here, not so long. And I tell you this much, we read the book of Kohelet on Sukkot. So that's actually coming up in about a month. We'll be reading, it'll be the holiday of Sukkot, and we read it on the Shabbat that shows up during the holiday of Sukkot. So I've actually had the pleasure to read this in synagogue year after year for a number of years. I happen to really enjoy reading the book of Kohelet, and so I always got a chance to read it. And this verse has always stood out to me. I always feel this is one of the most it's an easy takeaway of all the entire book of Kohelet. It's a very clear lesson. But we'll actually see that there's multiple layers to it. And it's particularly in how it's going to tie into the surrounding verses. Because again, if you're just reading the book, it will seem like a big conglomeration of smart ideas from King Solomon, which it's not. It's a system. So again, over here, this can be just taken as a one-off lesson. It can also be taken in the general in the ongoing theme of what we're seeing over here. So, and when he says like this, Al Tomar, a person should not say, do not say, Meh haya, what is it, or why is it, Shahayamim harishonim, that those early days, Hayu tovim me'ela, were better than these days. Ki lo mechachma sha'alta al zeh. It is not out of wisdom that you ask such a question. Okay? Again, that's a bit of a longer verse, so we'll read it through again. Al tomar, a person should not say, Meh haya, why is it? Literally, what is it? But the idea being, why is it? Shehayamim harishonim, that the early days, hayu tovim me'ela, were better than these days. Kilo mechachma shalta al zeh. It is not out, because it is not out of wisdom that you ask this question. Okay, these are all pretty familiar shorashim. There's not any outstanding words over here, but it's again, there's that kind of surface lesson, which is that if you go and you live your life saying, there was the good old days, so then you're going to lose out a lot of the present, right? If we're constantly living in the past, we tend to lose out on the present. I just heard today, and it's obvious, but people deal a lot today with depression and anxiety, and depression is worrying about the past, and anxiety is worrying about the future. Kind of interesting. I hadn't necessarily looked at it like that, but once you hear it, that makes sense. It's basically living in any other time besides for right now, besides for the present, which is why, a lot of people, they suggest when dealing with anxiety or depression, you focus on meditation and focusing on the present, realizing where you are right now. Total side point. But what we have over here again is him saying, King Solomon saying, again, on the surface level, he says, don't look at those old days and say, those were the good old days. Because that's not necessarily a wise statement that a person's saying. We live where we live right now. I once heard a rabbi say I heard a class from another rabbi, and he said that somebody once asked him, "Wow, wouldn't it be amazing to live in Krakow in the 1500s, where you would be surrounded by Torah scholars, you'd be surrounded by Jewish life and all sorts of things like that?" And he said, "Yeah, but can you imagine having to use an outhouse?" In that sense, like, we live in the times we live in because we fit the times we fit. If we believe in a God guiding our actions, then He made us now because we do the best work in the times that we live in right now. So we're meant to be here, and we gotta enjoy it. We gotta enjoy the time that we're here and do what we can with the time that we're here right now, instead of constantly living in the past. It's a easily packaged lesson. It's a little harder to put into practice, just practically, right? We all have fond memories of times that we I wouldn't mind going back to that point. But he's saying that it lacks a certain level of wisdom, because wisdom is saying, I'm going to do the best with what I got. That's trying to figure out how to make this time, this experience that I'm in right now, how to make that the best experience, whether that's physically, spiritually, in my relationships, etc. That's kind of that's the easily packaged lesson, I would say. Then I found it interesting, though, that when I was going through the commentaries over here, I found two very different explanations. Number one is the explanation of Rashi and the Mitsudah. So these are kind of our classic commentators. Rashi and the Mitsudah, they give us a one explanation of this verse over here. And they say that the explanation of the verse is that when you don't say, well, why was it that in earlier days, the days like the days that are mentioned in the book throughout the Tanakh, that everything was so amazing back then? Look at the days of Joshua where they were conquering the land of Israel and no one was getting in their way and everything was going well. Well, don't look at those days and say, why did they get all the good stuff? Because, this is how they explained it, because they were better people. So of course they got better stuff. Now, okay, so again, that's Rashi's explanation and Mitsudah's explanation. Now, I found this interesting that they don't always see eye to eye on explaining a verse, and they usually follow the explanations that are brought down in the Chazal, in the sages of the Talmud. What I found interesting is that this does not seem to be the lesson that the sages of the Talmud bring. So I'm how would I say this? I don't want to say I'm not comfortable with this explanation. It's an explanation. It's said by great sources, but in our system, I have a hard time engaging with that explanation because I think I don't know if that's necessarily the idea that we're trying to get across over here, because what we have over here is the book of Kohelet telling us that you live in the time you live in, and you should be proud of the time you live in, and you should do what you can with the time you live in, and that's how we understand wisdom. And so to then say, yeah, well, of course there were better days at a different time. They were more righteous people back then. Well, that kind of shuts the door on any growth possibility. It doesn't allow you to grow from that. So I found it interesting that the sages in the Talmud, they actually have a very different lesson from this verse over here. And what they say is like this. The actual line that the Talmud tells us is that the person is told, we are told to go to the judges and the judges and the officers who are judging the people of those days and ask them to interpret the Torah for us. So the Talmud goes ahead and says, well, what if the sages of your time are just not as smart as the sages of previous times? It says, doesn't matter. You go to the wise people of your generation, you go to them. They're wise, and they're the wise people for your generation. They're the right people to guide you. And it says, for example, Jephthah, who was not a Torah scholar, really. He was a military leader. But at the time that he lived, he was the appropriate person for somebody to go to for guidance, even though he was nowhere near on the level of Moses, or he was nowhere near on the level of Samuel. Okay? So even though let's say you happen to live in a time where you don't have great leaders, still you should go to them. You should go to whoever you have, because they're who you have. And, again, looking at it from that God sets up the world point of view, it's God put those people there to guide your generation, and not just be happy with it, but they're there for a reason. Learn how to get the most out of those people. So the underlying lesson of that I see as kind of a total opposite of the lesson that the other commentators are saying. Whereas the commentators seem to be indicating that this verse over here is saying, yeah, there were better times to be alive. What can you do? You don't live then. We're not as good as those people were. The Talmud says strikes a very different chord. It says, hey, you live when you live, and you deal with the people you deal with, and you have the leaders that you have, and that's who you're supposed to have. That's the life you're supposed to live. So very similar to our original prepackaged lesson, in the sense that it's saying that we're here at this time that we're in, and we're not supposed to be trying to live at a different time. We're not supposed to try to rehash or recreate the past. we're actually trying to settle into and make the best out of the life, out of the present. And again, that's what he understands to be chachma. Wisdom seems to be that idea that we're here in the present. We want to do the best with what we got, as we have it. And actually, if you follow the idea of chachma, of wisdom throughout the book, we've actually had this a lot of times where it's chachma is reacting with wisdom to the world around you, to what you have going on in your life. So in that sense, it really is, that's this lesson over here. It's he's trying to say, if you're trying to live in the past or live even in the future, he doesn't specifically say that, but trying to live in a different time and trying to keep on recreating the past, that's not necessarily a idea that's guided by wisdom, because that's not allowing yourself to live in the present. It's not allowing yourself to do the best you can with the present. You know, we have that definitely in history, when dealing with history, and trying to create a world around us right now that matches with our ideas of what, you know. Let's take a political example. I'm not going to, I don't like to get into politics, especially in this class, but we look at the world around us and we say, we'd like to recreate some other time. You know, there's groups in the country that would like to recreate the 60s. And there's other groups in the country who'd like to recreate the 80s. You know, there's other groups in the country who'd like to recreate the 90s or the 2000s, you know. And it's quite fascinating how we all look at the past and say, I want to recreate that. And you know what? There is some wisdom there, because you know, that's the idea of history in general, is you take from the past and you let it guide your future. But you don't want to just live in the past, because living in the past, again, doesn't allow you to live in the present. And so again, this verse has always stood out to me as an important lesson for myself, and just in how to live my life, is, you know, again, not to forget the past, not to not look forward to the future, but to try and live in the present. And it gets very hard, you know, when you're dealing with things that are that do create anxiety, that it gets very difficult. You know, you're welcome. But for example, when COVID first settled in, you know, of course, what else did we want than for it to be over? You know, and I remember hearing all the different, you know, ideas of when it's going to be over. You know, I remember this moment when I was in Phoenix at the time, Phoenix, Arizona. I remember this moment when this was still, I think we were still in March, maybe it was April of 2020. And the reports were that I think we're reaching the peak, you know, and it's going to just downhill from here. It's like, looking back, like, how crazy was that? We thought a month into COVID, it would all be over, you know? And, you know, obviously we learned, and you can't help at the time but can't wait for that day that it's over, or wish you were back in a time when it didn't exist. But unfortunately, that, first of all, that's not how life works. And unfortunately, that's not how chachma works. It's not how wisdom works. With wisdom, we actually want to try and figure out how to do what we can with the present that we're given. And it's no doubt it's very hard. It's very, very difficult, can be very, very difficult. And it takes a lot of practice, you know, and it's something that I personally am constantly trying to work on, and have to correct myself, I would say. I don't even know if that's the right word, but I'm personally trying to train. Something I'm constantly personally trying to train myself is how to live here and now, as opposed to in the past or too far into the future. You know, we want to always, again, learn from the past, prepare for the future, but live right now. You know, my wife actually has a little note on her wall that I'm looking at right now. I'm in her office right now. I got kicked out of my other space. And the note on the wall says, forgive your younger self, believe in your current self, and create your future self. So again, that's forgive your younger self, believe in your current self, and create your future self. I think it's a great line, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to believe in what we are right now and do the best with what we can with what we have right now. So All right, we have a couple more minutes, but this is really the perfect stopping point. Verse number 11 gets into a bit of a different topic, and so we will. I don't want to get started with that right now. Suffice it to say, oh, you know what? I had one more thing to say on this verse. Come to think of it, and that's how this ties into what we're saying. Into the series of verses over here, again, is how we've been talking about dealing with these other people who are making you crazy, and they can get you turn you to anger. And what it does is it settles you into this bad state. So here we're getting kind of the opposite, the other type of settling into a good state. So I don't have a great explanation of how it fits all together, but I think it does. I think there is something over here that's kind of saying that you can settle into a bad mindset. You could settle into anger, which doesn't let you move forward. Or you could settle into just rehashing the past and never getting past it. And saying either those days somebody did something against me that I can't stand and I can never get over it. I can't forgive it. Or something was so great in those past days that I can't move past it. I can't allow myself to move past it. Both of those are not wisdom. Wisdom says things happen, I learn from them, I grow from them, I appreciate them, but I want to live now. I want to live in my current present state right now. And so I think that's just kind of a little bit how it ties into the theme, the ongoing theme over here. As I said, verse number 11 will start a bit of a new idea, and then we'll continue from there next week. So again, thank you all for joining us.